On a crisp autumn morning at JFK International Airport, a young billionaire tech CEO walked through the terminal, pulling his carry-on bag behind him. He wasn't what most people pictured when they thought of a billionaire. Dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, he moved quietly through the crowd, watching people hurry past with their coffee cups and overnight bags. He had built his tech company from scratch in his garage 10 years ago, turning it into a $4.2 billion empire. But today, like most days when he traveled, he was just another passenger. He never announced himself or demanded special treatment. His mother had taught him that true character shows in how people treat those they think can't help them. Walking up to gate B7, he double-checked his first-class ticket to Los Angeles on his phone. The gate area was already crowded with travelers. Business people in suits tapping away on laptops, families trying to keep their children entertained, and tourists excitedly planning their California adventures. As he sat down in one of the uncomfortable airport chairs, he pulled out his phone to check his company's latest project updates. His team was working on new software that could help small businesses compete with bigger corporations. That's what he loved most about his work, using technology to help ordinary people achieve their dreams. The boarding call came right on time. As a first-class passenger, he was in the first group to board. He walked down the jet bridge, smiling politely at the ground crew. Inside the plane, the familiar smell of recycled air and new upholstery greeted him. The first-class cabin looked pristine, with its wide leather seats and extra legroom. A flight attendant stood at the entrance of the plane, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. However, when she saw him approaching first class, her smile flickered for just a second. He had seen that look before, the quick double take, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the unspoken question of whether he belonged there. He made his way to seat 2A, stored his laptop bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into his seat by the window. Through the glass, he could see the morning sun reflecting off other planes on the tarmac. In 12 hours, he would be in Los Angeles for a major tech conference, where he was the keynote speaker, though none of his fellow passengers knew that. The first-class cabin slowly filled up with other travelers. An older gentleman in an expensive suit who immediately put on an eye mask, a young woman who looked like a social media influencer, and a middle-aged couple who seemed to be celebrating something special. Each of them received a warm welcome from the same flight attendant who had given him that questioning look. He pulled out his phone one last time before the flight, sending a quick text to his sister, "On my way. Don't forget to feed my dog." His sister always joked that his pet lived better than most people, but he couldn't help spoiling the rescue pup who had kept him company during those long nights when he was just starting his company. Little did he know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The next few hours would not only test his patience, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice in the airline industry. But for now, he sat quietly, watching more passengers file past him toward the economy section, completely unaware that he was one of the wealthiest people on the plane. The plane's engines hummed steadily as the last passengers settled into their seats. In first class, our tech CEO had just opened his laptop to review some presentation slides when the senior flight attendant's voice cut through his concentration. She was speaking to another passenger, her tone warm and professional, offering a pre-flight champagne service. He could hear her footsteps moving closer, the gentle clink of glasses on her service tray. She stopped at each seat, greeting passengers with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard. Would you care for some champagne?" But when she reached his row, something changed. The warmth in her voice disappeared, replaced by a cool, clipped tone. "Your boarding pass, please," she said, not even offering the champagne. Her hand was already outstretched, fingers tapping impatiently on her serving tray. Several other first-class passengers glanced over, curious about the sudden change in atmosphere. He looked up from his laptop, maintaining his composure. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment, and he calmly reached for his phone to show his digital boarding pass. "Of course," he said quietly, turning the screen toward her. The flight attendant studied the boarding pass with exaggerated care, her lips pursed. "And do you have any ID to go with that?" she asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The couple across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. He produced his ID without comment, though he noticed she hadn't asked any other first-class passengers for theirs. The flight attendant examined it closely, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgery. "We need to maintain certain standards in first class," she said, emphasizing each word. A young woman in the row behind him shifted uncomfortably in her seat, pulling out her phone and beginning to record discreetly. The flight attendant didn't notice, too busy making a show of verifying his documents. "Everything seems to be in order," she finally said, sounding disappointed. "Though I must remind you that first-class passengers are expected to maintain appropriate behavior throughout the flight." She didn't offer him champagne before moving on to the next row, where her sunny demeanor instantly returned. The tech CEO took a slow, deep breath, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in the face of ignorance. He could feel the tension in the cabin, the sideways glances from other passengers, some sympathetic, others curious, a few seemingly agreeing with the flight attendant's behavior. He turned back to his laptop, trying to focus on his presentation, but his mind kept drifting to the foundation he'd been planning to start, one focused on workplace equality. This interaction was proving just how necessary that work would be. The pre-flight safety demonstration began, but the flight attendant kept watching him, as if waiting for him to do something wrong. When he reached up to adjust his air vent, her head snapped in his direction. When he opened the safety card in his seat pocket, she took a step forward before realizing what he was doing. Other flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and overhead bins, but they seemed to pick up on their colleague's attitude. They either ignored him completely or gave him the same suspicious looks. One even whispered something to her senior colleague while gesturing in his direction. The whole scene felt surreal. Here he was, sitting in a seat he paid for, being treated like an intruder. His company's annual revenue was more than this airline made in a quarter, but that shouldn't have mattered. No one should be treated this way, regardless of their bank account. As the plane began to taxi, he noticed more phones being discreetly raised to record what was happening. The flight attendant's behavior was becoming more obvious, more theatrical with each passing moment. Little did she know, her actions were about to spark a chain of events that would make headlines across the country. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and most passengers had settled into their flights, pulling out books or putting on headphones. In first class, the air felt heavy with tension. The tech CEO's throat was dry. He hadn't had anything to drink since going through security hours ago. He noticed the senior flight attendant making her rounds again, asking passengers about their drink preferences. She moved gracefully from seat to seat, writing down orders with a friendly smile. "Still or sparkling water? We have an excellent selection of wines as well." When she reached the row in front of him, she spent extra time chatting with a passenger about wine vintages. But when it was his turn, she walked right past him as if his seat were empty. He waited patiently, thinking perhaps she'd come back. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The drink cart rolled through, and everyone else in first class received their beverages. His throat felt like sandpaper now. He could see a glass of ice water on the passenger's tray table next to him, condensation dripping down its side. Finally, he pressed the call button, a small action that would trigger much bigger events. The sound of the call button chimed through the cabin. The flight attendant's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing when she saw which seat it came from. She took her time responding, serving another passenger a second glass of wine before making her way over. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Is there a problem?" "Could I please have a glass of water?" he asked politely, keeping his voice low and calm. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm very busy right now," she said loudly, "and we don't appreciate aggressive behavior in first class." A few passengers looked up, startled. The tech CEO blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I haven't been aggressive. I just pressed the call button to request some water." "Don't raise your voice at me," she snapped, even though he had spoken quietly. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I know threatening behavior when I see it." The young woman behind him was recording again. The older gentleman across the aisle had taken off his eye mask and was watching the scene unfold with a frown. Even the social media influencer had stopped scrolling through her phone to pay attention. "I don't mean to be any trouble," the tech CEO said calmly. "I'd just like some water, please, like everyone else received." "Are you suggesting I'm treating you differently?" The flight attendant's voice rose higher. "I could have you removed from this flight for making accusations." Other flight attendants had gathered at the front of the cabin now, watching the scene. One younger crew member looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her uniform sleeve as if she wanted to step in but wasn't sure how. The tech CEO remained silent for a moment, studying the flight attendant's name tag, memorizing her employee number. He'd faced discrimination before, but this was different. This was happening in front of dozens of witnesses, many of them now recording secretly on their phones. Is there a problem here? Another flight attendant finally stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "This passenger is being disruptive," the senior flight attendant declared. "He's demanding special treatment and making false accusations." More phones came out, more passengers started recording. The tech CEO noticed the couple by the window mouthing, "We saw everything," to him supportively. The social media influencer was typing rapidly on her phone, probably sharing the unfolding events with her followers. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. What had started as a simple request for water had escalated into something much uglier. But the worst was yet to come. None of them knew that in just a few minutes, this situation would explode into a viral moment that would dominate social media and news headlines for weeks to come. 30,000 feet in the air, the first-class cabin had become an uncomfortable stage for what was about to unfold. The tech CEO glanced at his watch. They were only 2 hours into the 6-hour flight. His presentation materials were still in his laptop bag in the overhead compartment, and he needed to review them before landing. He waited for a moment when the senior flight attendant seemed occupied at the front of the cabin before standing up to reach for his bag. The overhead bin creaked as he carefully opened it, making sure not to disturb other passengers' belongings. "Stop right there." The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. She rushed down the aisle, her comfortable shoes squeaking against the floor. "What do you think you're doing?" The tech CEO paused, his hand still on his laptop bag. "I'm just getting my computer," he explained calmly, though his heart was racing. "This is my bag, right here." "Step away from that bin immediately," she demanded, her voice rising with each word. "You can't just go through other people's belongings." The first-class cabin fell completely silent. Even the airplane's hum seemed to fade into the background. The social media influencer's perfectly manicured fingers were trembling as she recorded everything on her phone. "Man," he said softly, "this is my bag. You saw me put it here when I boarded. It has my company logo on the side. Don't you dare talk back to me." She stepped closer, her face flushed with anger. "I've seen your type before, thinking you can just take whatever you want." The older gentleman in 2C stood up. "Now wait just a minute," he began, but the flight attendant cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Sir, please stay out of this. I'm handling a security situation." The tech CEO slowly reached for his bag's tag to show his name, but before his fingers could touch it, it happened. The flight attendant's hand flew through the air, making a sharp cracking sound as it connected with his cheek. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin. Someone in business class screamed. The young flight attendant at the front dropped her serving tray, plastic cups bouncing across the floor. Time seemed to freeze. The tech CEO's hand moved to his cheek, more from shock than pain. Phones were recording from every angle now, nobody even trying to hide it anymore. The social media influencer's jaw had dropped, her perfectly applied lipstick forming a perfect O of surprise. The senior flight attendant seemed to realize what she'd done. Her hand was still hanging in the air, trembling slightly. The anger on her face melted into something else. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning recognition that she had just made a terrible mistake. Without saying a word, the tech CEO calmly took out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced precision, sending quick messages. Within seconds, his phone buzzed with responses. The couple by the window were the first to speak up. "We saw everything," the woman said firmly. "We're witnesses." Others nodded in agreement, their phones still recording. The younger flight attendant had finally found her voice. "I'm getting the captain," she said, hurrying toward the cockpit. The air in the cabin felt electric, charged with shock and anticipation. The tech CEO sat back down in his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't fought back, hadn't caused a scene. He didn't need to. In the age of smartphones and social media, justice often came in the form of viral videos and public accountability. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they'd be making an emergency landing, the senior flight attendant's face had turned pale. She had no idea that she had just slapped one of the country's youngest billionaires, or that in less than an hour, this incident would be making headlines across the nation. The plane began its descent much earlier than planned, banking sharply to the right. In first class, the atmosphere was crackling with tension. Some passengers were still recording, while others were frantically posting what they'd just witnessed on social media. The young influencer's hands shook as she typed, "You won't believe what I just saw on this flight." The senior flight attendant had retreated to the galley, her face ashen. She kept glancing at her hand as if she couldn't believe what it had done. The other crew members gave her a wide berth, none of them making eye contact. The younger flight attendant who'd fetched the captain was now speaking quietly into a phone at the front of the cabin. Meanwhile, the tech CEO sat calmly in his seat, holding his phone to his ear. "Yes, I need the whole team there," he said quietly. "And contact the airline's board directly." His cheek still showed a faint red mark where the flight attendant's hand had struck him. The older gentleman who had tried to intervene earlier leaned across the aisle. "Son," he said in a low voice, "I've got it all on video. What she did was completely uncalled for." His wife nodded vigorously, clutching her own phone like a precious artifact. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an incident in first class, we're making an emergency landing at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." A low murmur spread through the cabin as passengers in economy tried to peek forward, wondering what was happening. The social media influencer had already gone live on her platform, whispering dramatically into her phone, "They're making an emergency landing because a flight attendant just assaulted a passenger." The tech CEO's phone buzzed continuously now. News alerts were already popping up on passengers' phones. Major airline flight diverted due to crew member assault. The story was spreading faster than the plane could land. Through it all, he remained composed, occasionally checking his messages, but mainly staring straight ahead. The couple by the window had become his unofficial protectors, glaring at anyone who looked at him wrong. The wife even offered him an ice pack from her carry-on, which he politely declined. As the plane descended through the clouds, police lights could be seen flashing on the runway. The senior flight attendant's face went from pale to almost green. She gripped the galley counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The social media influencer was still live streaming. "Oh my God, there are like a dozen police cars waiting." Her followers were multiplying by the thousands every minute, the comment section exploding with reactions. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and as it taxied to the gate, more details about the tech CEO's identity were starting to circulate online. Someone had recognized him and posted his Forbes cover from last year. The news was spreading like wildfire. Tech billionaire racially profiled and assaulted on flight. The younger flight attendant's phone call had turned frantic. "Yes, sir, the CEO is already aware." "Yes, sir, I understand this is serious." "No, sir, I don't know why she." "Yes, sir, I saw everything." Through the windows, passengers could see not just police cars, but news vans pulling up to the terminal. The airline's PR nightmare was about to begin, and social media was already exploding with hashtags and viral videos of the incident. The tech CEO finally stood up, straightening his suit jacket. His lawyer's words echoed in his mind from their phone call. "Don't say anything. We're handling this. This is bigger than one incident now." He knew his response in the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, nobody moved. All eyes were on him and the senior flight attendant, who looked like she might faint at any moment. The real storm was about to begin, and everyone in that cabin knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The airplane door opened with a soft hiss. Cleveland police officers were the first aboard, their badges glinting under the cabin lights. Behind them came airport security, airline officials in sharp suits, and what looked like a small army of lawyers clutching briefcases. The tech CEO remained in his seat, calmly typing on his phone. His quiet confidence seemed different now, less like patience and more like someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. The first-class cabin had become dead silent, everyone waiting to see what would unfold. A distinguished-looking woman in an expensive suit rushed down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. "Sir," she said, slightly out of breath, "I'm the airline's vice president of operations. We came as soon as we heard." She stopped mid-sentence as the tech CEO looked up. The color drained from her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, You're him." The senior flight attendant, still standing in the galley, frowned in confusion. "Him who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The airline VP turned to her, eyes blazing. "That man you just assaulted. He's the founder and CEO of Tomorrow Tech. His company is worth billions. He's on the cover of this month's Business Weekly." The revelation rippled through the cabin. The social media influencer, still live streaming, gasped dramatically. "Wait, he's THA Tech CEO. The one who donated $50 million to education programs last year." Phones lit up everywhere as passengers Googled him. His face appeared on their screens, speaking at conferences, accepting awards, standing next to world leaders. The same face that now had a faint red mark on its cheek from the flight attendant's slap. The senior flight attendant grabbed the galley counter for support. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice breaking. "That's exactly the point." The tech CEO finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity." A team of lawyers had now boarded, led by a sharp-eyed woman who immediately walked up to him. "Everything's in motion," she said quietly. "The airline's board is meeting in emergency session." The police officers were taking statements from passengers, many eagerly showing their video recordings. The couple by the window kept saying, "We saw everything. We'll testify to everything." The young influencer's live stream had reached over 1 million viewers. Comments were flooding in. "He's the guy who made that app everyone uses. Isn't he building those affordable solar homes?" Did she really not recognize one of the most successful tech innovators in the country? But the tech CEO wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was looking at his phone, showing his lawyer something. "I don't want to sue them," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "I want to change them." The airline VP was now frantically making calls. "Yes, sir, he's here." "No, sir, he seems very calm." "Yes, sir, the entire board should definitely come." Through the windows, passengers could see more news vans arriving. The story was exploding across all social media platforms. Hashtag First Class Racism and hashtag Tomorrow Tech CEO were trending nationwide. The senior flight attendant had slumped into a jump seat, her head in her hands. The reality of what she'd done was sinking in. She hadn't just assaulted a passenger, she'd attacked someone with the power to bring serious changes to the entire airline industry. But perhaps most telling was how the tech CEO remained exactly as he had been throughout the flight. Calm, dignified, and focused not on revenge, but on something bigger. As he stood to leave the plane, he paused beside the flight attendant. "You didn't just hit me," he said quietly. "You struck every person who's ever faced discrimination on a flight. And now we're going to make sure it never happens again." The airport's VIP lounge had been quickly cleared out and transformed into an impromptu crisis center. Outside, news helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trying to catch a glimpse through the windows. The airline's entire executive team had arrived, their faces grim as they watched social media exploding with video clips of the incident. The tech CEO sat at the head of the conference table, his lawyer beside him. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from other CEOs, civil rights leaders, and even politicians were pouring in. The video had gone viral in record time, with millions of views and shares across all platforms. "We're prepared to offer a very generous settlement," one of the airline executives said, sliding a paper across the table. The number written on it had many zeros. The tech CEO didn't even glance at it. Instead, he pulled out his tablet and turned it around to show them. On the screen was a presentation titled Airline Industry Reform Initiative. The executives exchanged nervous looks. "I don't want your money," he said quietly. "I want change, real change." He started swiping through slides showing statistics about discrimination in air travel, testimonies from affected passengers, and proposed solutions. Meanwhile, in another room, the senior flight attendant sat with union representatives and HR officials. Her hands trembled as she watched her actions play out on news channels. Every major network was running the story. Tech billionaire racially profiled and assaulted on flight. The social media influencer from the flight had already gained 100,000 new followers. Her live stream from the plane had been picked up by news outlets worldwide. It was surreal, she told reporters gathered in the terminal. He was so calm, even after she hit him, like he knew this was bigger than just him. Back in the VIP lounge, the tech CEO was outlining his vision. First, we establish a foundation focused on airline industry reform. Your company will be the first partner. His lawyer nodded approvingly as he continued. We'll implement new training programs, create accountability systems, and set up a passenger advocacy board. The airline's PR team was working frantically to control the damage. Their social media accounts were overwhelmed with angry comments and calls for boycotts. #BoykottAirline was trending alongside #TechCEOStrong. The airport police had finished taking statements from passengers. The couple from the window seats had stayed behind to give detailed accounts. We fly first class all the time, the wife told officers, but we've never seen such blatant discrimination. Headlines were now focusing on the tech CEO's response. Instead of threats of lawsuits, he was pushing for industry-wide change. News anchors were praising his measured approach. In a moment when he could have sought revenge, he chose reform. The airline executives looked increasingly uncomfortable as he laid out his plans. Mandatory sensitivity training for all staff. Independent reviews of passenger complaints. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Each point was backed by data and examples. Outside the VIP lounge, crowds of reporters had gathered. The story had struck a chord with people around the world. Social media was filled with others sharing their own experiences of discrimination during air travel. The young flight attendant who had called the captain appeared briefly before the press. What happened today was wrong, she said, her voice shaking but determined. And I'm glad someone with power is finally going to do something about it. As evening approached, the tech CEO finally stood up from the conference table. The airline executives had agreed to every one of his proposals. They really had no choice. The public relations disaster would have been catastrophic otherwise. Remember, he said as he gathered his things, this isn't about punishing one person or one airline. It's about making sure nobody else has to go through what happened today. His words would be quoted in newspapers around the world the next morning. As he left the airport that evening, people stopped to watch him pass. They didn't see anger or bitterness on his face, just determination. The kind of determination that had helped him build a billion-dollar company and would now help him build something even more valuable: change. 1 month after the incident, the tech CEO stood at a podium in a packed conference room. Camera flashes lit up his face as he announced the launch of the Fair Skies Foundation. Behind him, representatives from 12 major airlines sat in a row, all of them having signed on to the new initiative. What happened to me was not unique, he said into the microphones, but the response to it will be. His words echoed through the room as he outlined the foundation's goals. The red mark on his cheek had long since faded, but the determination in his eyes burned brighter than ever. In the audience, the young flight attendant who had called the captain that day sat watching. She had been appointed to the Foundation's advisory board, along with other airline staff who wanted to be part of the solution. Her inbox was full of messages from colleagues sharing their own stories of witnessing discrimination. The social media influencer from the flight was there too, using her newly expanded platform to document the changes. Her followers had grown to millions, and she now focused on highlighting stories of positive change in the travel industry. Sometimes it takes one moment to change everything, she told her viewers during a live stream. Back at the airline's training center, new programs were already in place. Staff gathered in classrooms, watching real-world scenarios and learning how to recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. The videos didn't show the tech CEO's incident. He had specifically requested that it not be used. "We're not here to shame anyone," he had said. "We're here to learn and grow." The older couple from the flight had become regular speakers at these training sessions, sharing their perspective as witnesses. "It's not enough to not be prejudiced," the wife would say. We have to actively stand against prejudice when we see it. In the airline's headquarters, a new passenger advocacy office had been established. The walls were covered with charts tracking complaint responses and resolution rates. A photo hung in the lobby, the tech CEO shaking hands with airline executives at the foundation's launch. Below it, a quote read, "Change happens when we choose to learn from our mistakes." The foundation's website featured stories from travelers of all backgrounds sharing their experiences. Each story ended with concrete actions taken to address the issues raised. The comment sections were filled with messages of support and similar stories, creating a community of people working toward change. International airlines began reaching out, wanting to implement similar programs. The tech CEO's company developed an app that made it easier for passengers to report incidents and track responses. It quickly became the industry standard. The senior flight attendant from the incident had gone through intensive training and counseling. Instead of being fired, she had asked to become part of the solution. Now she spoke to new airline employees about her experience, her voice shaking but sincere. "I thought I was just having a bad day. I didn't realize I was carrying prejudices I didn't even know I had." Local schools began inviting foundation representatives to speak about discrimination and its impact. Children would sit wide-eyed as they learned about how one incident led to industry-wide change. But why did it take a billionaire to make things better? One student asked during a session. The tech CEO had an answer for that. "It shouldn't have," he said during a television interview. "Every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their bank account. That's why we're working to give everyone a voice." By the end of the first month, other industries were taking notice. Hotel chains, restaurants, and retail stores began reaching out to the foundation, asking for help in reviewing their own practices. What had started as one ugly moment at 30,000 feet was becoming a movement for change across the service industry. The tech CEO kept his original first-class boarding pass framed in his office, not as a reminder of the incident, but as a promise to keep pushing forward. Sometimes, he told a reporter, the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we choose to learn from them instead of seeking revenge. 6 months after the incident, the tech CEO sat in the same first-class cabin where it all began. This time, he was flying to accept an award for corporate leadership in social change. As he settled into his seat, a familiar face appeared, the senior flight attendant from that fateful day. She looked different now, more confident but also more humble. She was leading the airline's new passenger relations team, using her experience to teach others. Their eyes met, and she gave a small nod. They had both come a long way from that turbulent day. The young influencer's latest video about the changes had just hit 10 million views. "Remember that viral flight incident?" she said in the intro. "Well, you won't believe what's happened since then." The comments section was filled with stories of positive experiences, of staff going above and beyond to make all passengers feel welcome. In airports across the country, new signs hung at every gate, "Everyone deserves to fly with dignity." The airline's training program had become so successful that other companies were paying to use it. Even small regional airlines had adopted the new standards, proving that change was possible regardless of company size. The older couple who had witnessed everything that day were now regular consultants for the foundation. They had just finished their 100th speaking engagement, sharing their message about the importance of speaking up. Being a silent witness, the wife would say, is being part of the problem. The tech CEO's company had released a free app that let passengers rate their travel experiences and report incidents. But surprisingly, reports of discrimination had dropped by 70% across all participating airlines. The training was working, people were learning, changing, growing. Back at the airline's headquarters, the wall of charts showed the progress. Customer satisfaction scores had hit record highs. Staff morale had improved dramatically. The company had even started winning awards for its inclusive workplace culture. The young flight attendant who had called the captain that day had been promoted to head of crew training. "We don't just teach procedures anymore," she explained to a news crew. "We teach people to see each other as human beings first." The foundation's success had sparked a movement. Hotels had copied the program. Restaurant chains had implemented similar training. Even retail stores were following suit. What started as one incident at 30,000 feet had touched the ground and spread across industries. On social media, the hashtag #RespectForAll had replaced the angry ones from 6 months ago. People shared stories of positive changes they'd witnessed. The conversation had shifted from outrage to hope, from anger to progress. The senior flight attendant had just published an article about her journey. "I was the villain in a viral video," she wrote, "but thanks to someone's forgiveness, I became part of the solution." Her words had touched many others who needed the courage to admit their mistakes and change. As the plane took off, the tech CEO looked out the window at the sunset. His phone buzzed with a message. Another airline wanted to join the program. He smiled, thinking about how one dark moment had led to so much light. The flight crew on this trip was from the first batch of graduates from the new training program. They'd moved through the cabin with natural warmth and respect for everyone, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Real change wasn't just about rules, it was about hearts and minds. A young passenger recognized him and whispered, "Thank you for making flying better for everyone." The tech CEO just smiled and replied, "We all did this together." As the plane cruised at altitude, he opened his laptop to work on his acceptance speech for tomorrow. The first line read, "6 months ago, I experienced discrimination that could have ended in anger. Instead, it ended in understanding." Sometimes the worst moments can bring out the best in humanity if we choose to learn, grow, and change together.